Before I speak, let me just do one thing. How long ago was it that somebody up on this stage might be lighting up a cigarette? Just 10 years. Just 10 years. In fact, 10 years ago, it would be possible that many of you would be smoking in this room. And 20 years ago, nurses and doctors were not only smoking in hospitals, they were giving cigarettes to the patients. We were smoking in airplanes just 20 years ago. This entire nation not only tolerated, but allowed smoking everywhere. But we don't anymore. We've turned a corner. 360 million people have changed their behavior so that it's now a taboo to smoke in a public place. That means that people who don't agree with the idea have changed their behavior. It means people who are indifferent to the idea have changed their behavior. It means people who are totally detached have now changed the way they sell their products and services, the way they conduct their business meetings, the way they interface with the most important people in their lives because of a new social norm. And it's not just cigarette smoking or tobacco cessation. There have been intentional campaigns in this country that have turned the corner 180 degrees. Recycling, breastfeeding, seatbelt usage. There was a time in this country when people regularly pulled out of the driveway with nobody buckled in. In fact, there was a time when there were no seatbelts in the car. But today, none of us would think about pulling away until we hear that click, 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 especially if there's kids in the back. We've turned the corner. It's now easier to do the right thing. If I lit up this cigarette in this room, just the smell of the smoke and the smoke itself would be a problem. It's easier to do the right thing. So when we talk about changing people's behavior on a grand scale, there are precedents. There are so many precedents that have happened so many times that quantitative research has been done on what it takes to succeed to change the nation's behavior. There's a woman named Chris Economos, a Tufts University professor and a social activist, who did a research study about 14 years ago. And in that study, she documented 10 key elements to creating a social movement. 10 key elements to creating a national social movement. She studied each one of these things that I've named, these 4 areas, and she identified what made them work. When I do my session later this afternoon, we'll be going through them one by one, but just to give you an idea of what they include, frame your intent as a crisis, because you've got to get it on the front burner. Present the research and include the economic impact. Have evangelists, have a plan, conduct communications, and so on. These 10 elements can be used not only to chart a grand challenge like stopping smoking in America, but also to conduct an internal campaign, like how do we move to stage 4 and become an innovative organization? If you want to see your organization take a leadership position when it comes to leading learning, and you've got a CEO and the CEO is saying, I think we're there, we're doing a good job, and you look around and you know you're not, or you know that there's so much more that you can do, the first thing you've got to do is frame it as a crisis to get her or his attention. Because that human being is juggling so much, has so many priorities, and is constantly scanning the environment for the things that need the most attention, that if you don't frame it as a crisis, you won't be able to grab their attention. Now, is there a crisis? If you don't reach your members, if you provide them with shoddy learning, if they go to other places to learn the things they need to learn, is that going to create a problem for your organization? And if the answer is yes, you've got to package that so that you get the CEO's attention. What about the research? Well, here you've got an outside expert who's presented a maturity model, right? There's documentation that shows what it is that takes to make your organization an exemplar when it comes to leading learning. You can present that. What about the economic case? If you had more people participating in your online forums, in your education sessions, would that translate to more people showing up at the conference, to increases in membership? Do your research up front so that when you take the case forward, you've got something that you can present that will not only grab their attention, but will give them a path forward. So let me talk a little bit about the grand challenges on the outside and give you a couple of examples, and then let's talk about how to bring that inside to the organization, because I think both are relevant here. First of all, a couple of examples. The American Nurses Association, Marla Weston, the CEO, is my client. I'm working with Marla, and next year, in 2017, we're going to be launching Healthy Nurse, Healthy Nation. The purpose of this initiative is to measurably improve the health of America's 3.6 million nurses, and by extension, the rest of the country. This is a grand challenge. It's a big, bold goal that is addressing a socially intractable problem. Now, take just a minute to consider the American Nurses Association. There's about 175,000 nurses who are members. That's just 5% of the total number of nurses in the United States, 3.6 million. Now, 3.6 million nurses means that 1 out of every 100 people in this country is a nurse. How many people in this room have a nurse in their family? Raise their hand. Look around. Just take a second. Look around. It's like this in every room I go into. When you walk down the street and you see 100 people, at least one of them is a nurse. And if you're near a healthcare facility like we are now, it's more than that, right? So nurses are everywhere. And what we know about nurses, what Marla knew about nurses, was that in every category except for smoking, they had more risk. They were lower. They scored lower than the average American. That means they're more overweight, they're more stressed out, they're getting less sleep. The list goes on. And that nurse then is in jeopardy. And nurses are the keystone to our healthcare system. You know, the keystone is that stone that's over, when you build an arch, there's a stone that's called the keystone, that back in the old days, before they had all kinds of modern adhesives and everything, when the arches were built just based on weight, they would insert the keystone at the top, and that would hold together the arch. And you know, the architect of the arch, when they unveiled an arch back in the old days, the architect had to stand underneath it to prove that it would hold up, right? That keystone's really important. The keystone holds the whole thing together. Nurses are the keystone of the healthcare system. They interface with the patient. They interface with the family. They interface with the doctors. They dispense the medication. They run the technology. They're the representative of the hospital, of the specialty that they represent. If the nurse goes down, the whole system goes down. And so here you have nurses, the keystone, in jeopardy, because in every category they're suffering, right? They're more prone to illness, they're more prone to getting hurt, they're more prone to losing their jobs because of injury. So we've got to take care of the nurses. Now, when Marla envisioned Healthy Nurse, Healthy Nation, and I was in the senior team meeting when she first did, what she thought to herself was not, how do I provide value to the 175,000 nurses who are my members? She thought, how do we provide value to 3.6 million nurses? That's the beginning of a grand challenge. That's a pivot out of that allegiance to the people who are sending you a check to people who represent every aspect of your discipline, whether it's a trade or a profession. And that's where a grand challenge is born, in that pivot. Because now what you're saying is that we own a particular slice, a demographic of America, and we can pull on that demographic and we can create value for a much larger group, much larger. And then that larger group not only knows who you are, but they become invested in your success. Quick example from Barbara Bird-Keenan, who used to be the CEO of the Institute of Food Technologists. She's now the CEO of the Endocrine Society, but a few years back, she was at IFT in Chicago. Now, IFT has about 17,000 members. They're split basically into two groups. You've got food scientists and you've got academics. So these are the people who make sure that your lettuce isn't crawling with bugs when you pick it up at the grocery store. These are the people who make Twinkies. These are the people who, design all kinds of food and make sure that the food that you get is healthy and that you're all right and safe. That's their job. When Barbara took over IFT, there were about 17,000 people who really cared whether it lived or died, right? 17,000. Barbara came to Washington, D.C., and she decided that she wanted to play a bigger game. So she started contacting people at USAID, at WHO. And you know what they said to her the first time she came? They said, "Who are you? You're an association. All you have is self-interest. Go away." because that's the reputation associations have in the larger market space. We represent our members. So Barbara thought to herself, she thought, what kind of a card could I create so that I can get into the game? What is it that people need when it comes to food that only I can do, or that I'm well positioned to do? And she came up with the Global Food Traceability Center. Because at that time, if there was bad beef in Burkina Faso or bad broccoli in Thailand, nobody knew how to find out where it came from. Right? But she had all the food scientists, so she could figure it out. So she stood up the Global Food Traceability Center. It exists to this day with one full-time staff person. And then she came back to DC. And when USAID and WHO said, who are you? She said, I run the Global Food Traceability Center. And they said, let's talk. And she started having conversations. And eventually she created a conference called the Power of Three in Chicago. And the Power of Three refers to food, energy, and water, the three ingredients for feeding 9 billion people on planet Earth in the year 2050. That's what the Power of Three stood for. And not only did she have representatives from governments, not only did she have USAID come to speak at her conference, but she had people in the room from Monsanto and Archer Daniels Midland who were prepared to fund the activity she was putting together. Because when you get a grand challenge right, and her grand challenge was feeding 9 billion in the year 2050, when you get it right, resources start to flow. That means people, it means money, it means time, it means energy. Other people become invested because you've identified a common agenda that everybody has an investment in achieving. And that's the key to a grand challenge, is that common agenda. Marla Weston did it with American Nurses Association. Healthy nurse, healthy nation. Who stepped forward to help Marla? The U.S. Army did, in a big way. What can the U.S. Army provide Marla? Well, one, they provided her with the research that she needed to roll out her model for what it means to be healthy. They had decades of research that had been pulled together and already formatted in an easy-to-use model that they were rolling out with service people and their families. And they gave it to her, all of it, so that she could use it. Why did they do it? Because for the U.S. Army, the health of our nurses is a national security threat, right? 10 years ago, when someone came into a recruiting station, 1 out of 2 people were ready to serve. Today, it's 1 out of 4. They recognize that the health of our nation is a national security threat and that their nurses are going to be the ones who are in the best position to doing something about it. So they literally see healthy nurse, healthy nation as a solution to a national security threat. CVS Caremark stepped forward. Why did they step forward? Because they employ 9,000 nurses and they're self-insured. And anything that they can do to get those nurses healthier hits their bottom line. Self-interest. Nonetheless, strong self-interest. So they became a player. Harvard Medical School stepped forward. Why did they step forward? Because they are the only major academic institution that has conducted longitudinal studies on nurses' health. And their sample size is something like, I'm going to get this wrong, but it's something like 14,000. And here Marla's going after 3.6 million. Imagine if they could have that data set. So what did they say? They said, we'll crunch your data for free. So now, here's Marla Weston at the American Nurses Association, and she's pushing this initiative out to 3.6 million nurses. And who does she have as her partners? Harvard Medical School, the U.S. Army, CVS Caremark, and there's about 10 others as well. So this gives her great validity, and it also creates a groundswell coalition that can mobilize to create the social movement that will be launched in 2017. This is what a grand challenge looks like. What it brings to the American Nurses Association is much greater visibility. I'm sure there'll be a migration for the other 95% of nurses who don't yet belong. There'll be some nurses who come into membership. But what Marla's looking at, and she's playing an infinite game here, what Marla's looking at is she wants to become recognized across the nation as a grand challenge organization that makes our nation healthier and stronger. One more example. Kevin Keller at the CFP Board of Standards. They certify financial planners. In the financial planning industry, there is a horrible culture when it comes to mirroring America's demographics. It's mostly old white guys, right? That's who's doing well in the finance. And it's well known that there's a lot of issues and there's a lot of court cases around misogyny. They don't have the kind of racial diversity that they want. And you know what? These large finance giants want to change, but they're struggling because they have a culture that was built in another time. And so they need help. So who better to help them than the Certified Financial Planner Board of Standards? So Kevin Keller, along with his board of directors, gave birth to something that's called the Center for Financial Planning, that has as its grand challenge to create a workforce that mirrors America's demographics. So we have women in finance groups that are working together on this. We have the National Urban League. We have organizations that represent Hispanics and Asians coming into play. And it's being funded by the largest finance players in the industry. Millions of dollars are being given. Already they've received $2.3 million, and they have a goal of raising $15 million in the next 5 years. And it's coming in. The conversations are going well. And the reason it's coming in is because these large finance giants are hemorrhaging talent. One of them has 95% turnover in the first 3 years of employment. 95% turnover in the first 3 years of employment. So giving the Center for Financial Planning a couple of $1 million is a drop in the bucket when you look at the expense that's going on with their talent hemorrhaging, right? So now we have the Center for Financial Planning. It's again pivoted, see how it's gone from just serving the certified financial planners to now serving the entire finance industry and by extension, serving all of America. Because their vision is that every American has ethical, competent financial planning at their disposal. Whereas right now, guess who has most of it, right? It's the old white guys who have most of it. Well, we're going to change that. So these are examples of real-life grand challenges that associations have taken on. Now, how do we focus that energy inside our organizations? It's one thing if you get involved in, looking large, but what if you want to go internal? I wrote down 6 steps based on the maturity model. This is just one example, right, for operationalizing it. You can create your own, but think of this one example. The first thing is take this assessment and put it in front of your senior leadership team or your board of directors. If you can, conduct the assessment first so that you're putting the results in front of them. But if you can't get that far, just put the assessment itself and use that chart to start a conversation. You listen well and hard to that conversation because you, as the agent for change in the leading learning space, can deduce the education that that particular group is going to need to understand what it takes to get to stage 4. When you hear how they talk about the different bullet points, you'll get an idea about what they know and what they don't know, and that should become then your assignment for educating them so that they're up to speed and they can play well in that space. Right? You're listening for educational deficits, and then you go back and educate them. So the third step is provide the education. Make sure that they get what they need so that they understand the value of the maturity model. Then the fourth step is to target the goal. What is it that you want to do as an organization? Do you want to be at stage 4? Is that your ultimate place? Then build the consensus in the group to target the goal, and then discuss, this is the 5th step, discuss the strategic value in terms of value and impact. That was that left axis that we saw there. In other words, why would we do this? Why would the board of directors sponsor this or target this? Why would the CEO go after this? What's the value and impact that it's going to bring? And then the last thing is to identify the gap that you have to cross from where you are to where you want to be and operationalize that gap. That's your job, is to figure out what it's going to take to get from where you are to where you want to be, and then carry those people across. So that's an example of taking this model and turning it internally and saying, here's how we're going to run this in our organization. Now, I didn't set my timer. Where are we? Are we done?
We're about done.
We're about done. Okay. All right. That's my talk.